Good morning, everyone. My name is Tony Fleo, and I serve as the CEO of Social Venture Partners Dallas. So we welcome our audience to a Social Venture Partners event. This is the ninth session in our Respond series, and we are delighted to be presenting with you and to you today on this important Supreme Court decision, the DACA decision. Social Venture Partners is an organization of engaged men and women who come together to bring their time, their financial resources, and their talents to help individuals grow their impact, philanthropic impact, and their good that they can do in the community, and to also help organizations that are working on the front lines. Many of the organizations which we have worked with over our past 20 years in Dallas are on the front lines working on the COVID crisis, and we are so pleased and proud of the work and the services that they provide to our community. You know, we are a nonprofit ourselves, and so your financial support is critical to us being able to bring these opportunities to the community, to the whole community, free of charge. And so we are also grateful to our sponsors. Today, we have a presenting sponsor, the law firm of Lynn, Pinker, Hurst, and Schwegman, and Andres Correa, who is a partner with the firm, will be here with us to just say a few words and to welcome you to the presentation today. Andres?
Good morning, everyone. It is my great privilege to be here and to be associated really in any way with the group, the panelists today, with Tony, with SVP. Their work is amazing. I've been involved in it myself, and it is just, it's incredible and necessary work. My name is Andres Correa. I'm a civil trial lawyer here in Dallas with the firm of Lynn, Pinker, Hurst, and Schwegman. We handle commercial disputes, business litigation. This panel in particular, though, it's very special to me, this question, this issue, because I myself was a beneficiary of the Texas DREAM Act back in 2001. I was never undocumented, and I would never compare my experience to the painful struggle of undocumented youth and what they have to go through. There's one thing I shared with some of them anyway, and it was that I came over as a very young child. I went through public schools, but I was a visa holder. And that meant that the doors of higher education were a little more closed to me than to my friends who had done the same things in school, who I had shared experiences with for many years. I couldn't afford education. There was no financial aid for a visa holder like me. Tuition was 3 times as high in Texas state colleges. But the DREAM Act changed that. The DREAM Act allowed me, as well as a number of other immigrant youth, to be treated just like any other graduate of a Texas public school by paying in-state tuition, by receiving some access to some financial aid, and really for me, by opening up a new world of opportunities for scholarships and for aid. Now, I wish, you know, the one ointment in my story is that thanks to all of that, you now have one more lawyer in America. I think my story would be better if I could tell you I was a doctor or a nurse or something else. But I would like to think that it's allowed me to be in some rooms as an attorney, as a commercial litigator, where I can spread a little bit of awareness that doesn't always exist despite good intentions, where I can meet people who have not come across people who have had this kind of experience and hopefully help them learn and help them join this cause and help spread opportunity for everyone. So thank you so much. It's my privilege to be here to help in any way. And thank you, Tony, for the opportunity.
Andres, thank you so much. And thank you to the firm for sponsoring our event today. And if you don't mind, if you could hang on with us for the session and stay on the panel, and feel free to respond to any of the comments that panelists are making today. It is a privilege to have with us one of our Texas state representatives from House District 103, State Rep Rafael Anchia, who is with us today. Representative Anchia currently serves as the chairman of the House Committee on International Relations and Economic Development. He also serves as a member of the Energy Resources Committee and the House Administrative Committees. Most recently, Representative Anchia was appointed to serve on the Texas Privacy Protection Advisory Council. And in 2017, Representative Anchia was elected by his peers as chairman of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. So we welcome the representative today, and we thank you for carving out the time to be with us. Our next guest is Laura Collins, who is the director of the Bush Institute SMU Growth Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute. And Ms. Collins previously served as the Director of Immigration Policy at the American Action Forum. She has experience in politics, working as a senior research analyst at the Republican National Committee for the 2012 election cycle and in the Texas House of Representatives for the 82nd legislature. So we welcome you, Laura. Thank you for joining us today. And finally, we have a guest coming to us from the Seattle area. And so we welcome you to North Texas and to a North Texas audience. Thank you so much for being with us. We welcome Luis Cortez Romero, who partly defended part of the Supreme Court DACA case and is the managing partner and immigrant advocacy and litigation at the Litigation Center. So Luis Cortez, we welcome you. Congratulations on your successful work before the Supreme Court. Thank you for allowing me to track you down from a news article that I read on LinkedIn. And thank you for saying yes to joining our audience here in Dallas. So we're gonna get right to it if you don't mind. Ms. Collins, I'm gonna start with you. Would you mind sharing a little bit with our audience about the mission of the Bush Institute? Many of us have been there. It is a beautiful facility. We are proud to have it in Dallas. And talk to us a little bit about your role as it pertains to our topic today.
Well, first, I would like to say good morning and thank you so much for having me. This is a great topic to talk about right now, very timely. At the Bush Institute, we believe in developing leaders, fostering policy, and taking action to solve today's most pressing challenges. And in my role at the Bush Institute on the economic growth team, my policy portfolio is immigration, because we think that two things about immigration. One, that it is one of today's most pressing challenges. Immigration's good for our economy. It's good for our culture. We are a nation of immigrants, and these are things that we need to continue as a tradition of welcoming America. The other thing is, we are concerned about economic growth and making sure that people have opportunity. And so immigration is one of those pieces that's really important. A pro-growth economic strategy necessarily involves having a strong legal immigration system. And so those are the two places where I really come to this from in terms of economic growth. I mentioned that that immigration is good for the economy. We know that immigrants contribute greatly to our economy. We know they accelerate the pace of economic growth. We know that they pay lots of taxes and they help us with our fiscal situation. And that's true on a variety of fronts. We see this a lot actually in our cities. We had an interesting finding recently. My colleague Colin Clark has this new report he put out with Opus Fabio, and what they found was they were looking at the innovation impact of universities. But there was this interesting finding there where they looked at, they found that universities that were in metro areas that had large immigrant populations, regardless of the size of the metro area, really had higher innovation impact. And they aren't really quite sure why that is exactly. They haven't gotten into the depth of that piece of it, but they know that just as I do, that immigrants are innovative, they're entrepreneurial, they tend to get patents at higher rates than native born Americans. And so those are some things that might be connected. So we know that, immigrants contribute to our economy across different sectors, and innovation impact is one of those places. And that's just one of those surprising findings that we're just now finding out. But I'd say, to wrap up, it's that we know that immigrants are good for our economy. Economists agree across the board. I think there's probably only one, if you follow immigration at all, that really doesn't like immigration's contributions to our economy. But immigration's a win-win for our nation, for our economy, and those are the things that we really advocate for at the Bush Institute.
Thank you, Laura, so much. Representative Anchea, if the immigration is so good for the economy, why do we struggle with it so much? Give us a framework for how you think about it in the legislature and how the Texas legislature is thinking about it in light of the recent Supreme Court decision.
Well, Tony, thanks again for inviting me. It's good to be on with a lot of familiar and friendly faces. Andres, thank your firm for supporting this important event. As you said in the introduction, I chair the Mexican-American Legislative Caucus, and we are the largest and oldest Latino legislative caucus in the United States. We've got over 40 members. We're bipartisan. And we've been sort of at the front lines of not only advocating at the federal level, but also trying to protect our own State Dream Act that Andres and so many others that I'm close to were able to avail themselves of. you'll recall that our Texas Dream Act, also known as the Noriega Act for former State Representative Rick Noriega, was passed on a bipartisan basis. I think there were only about 4 or 5 legislators out of 150 who did not support the act, and was signed by Governor Rick Perry, of all people, with a really a broad bipartisan consensus. I wish we still had that consensus today in the legislature. It is, it's unfortunate because, as Laura pointed out, all the data is really settled on this issue. I mean, the contributions of Dreamers, 700,000 Dreamers that contribute mightily to this country, and immigrants generally. The one thing that you don't often see in my bio is I'm the son of immigrants too. And when I try to explain this to people in layman's terms, my mother's from Mexico, my dad is Basque and from northern Spain, and we've gone, you know, he loves this country a lot, because he always says, is only in America can you take talent in one generation that may have been sheep herders and goat herders, which is what my father did at 12 years old after the Spanish Civil War. And then in one generation, you're immediately able to stair-step up that infrastructure of opportunity to lawyers, business people, and elected officials, which me and my siblings are. And some people would think, well, goat herders and sheep herders to politicians and lawyers, that's a step back. Most people would say it is actually a step forward. So, you know, the Texas Dream Act has created that infrastructure of opportunity for people to become the doctors, the lawyers, the essential workers of our economy. And we're seeing it over and over and over again, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. I see it in my everyday life. My girlfriend is a former Dreamer. On my team at our legislative office, we have Jack Hernandez, who I think is probably, he's a Salvadoreño. He's watching here today. And I'm really mad at him because he just turned down SMU to go to a Brand X school called University of Texas. And but he's going to be naturally successful. He's bilingual, he's bicultural, he's highly educated, exactly the type of people that we want in our society. I will say another thing just about the sort of tenor of immigrants generally and Dreamers specifically. My father, when he goes back to his village, it's about a village of 4,000 people. There are still people in the village who have never left. And oftentimes there are some of his friends that he grew up with, and they'll say, Julio, come down to the bar with us and have a drink. And my father, who rarely drinks, was the guy who, when he was talking to his friends, says, hey, things are really limited around here. And his friends would say, yeah, they stink. Come on, let's go to the bar and get a drink. My father said, no, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to be a risk taker. I'm going to be that person that goes across the ocean to a place I don't know, with a language I don't know how to speak, and I'm going to make my way. I'm going to send money back home to take care of my family back here. And that's who we get. Those are the Dreamers. They're the entrepreneurs, the risk takers. When certain politicians say we don't get Mexico's best, we did get Mexico's best with my mother, whose family emigrated here in the mid-50s. Because those are the people who want to come, be innovative, be entrepreneurial, and contribute to our society. I will say, and before I go any further, and because I want to sort of allow there to be some Q&A here, even the Texas Dream Act, which back in 2001 was well settled and had a really robust bipartisan consensus, it continues to be under attack. Just 2 sessions ago, we had people coming at the Texas Dream Act, State Representative Jonathan Stickland, State Representative, he's from Tarrant County, State Representative Matt Rinaldi from Dallas County, made a run at trying to eliminate in the appropriations bill the State Dream Act, the Noriega Act. And we were able to defeat that effort on a point of order. But I will tell you that anytime something hits the floor that's immigration related, my friends on the other side of the aisle don't show a ton of political courage. And I feared, had we not been able to kill that on a point of order, and that was the members of the Mexican-American Legislative Caucus who did that, that if that had gotten to the floor, the State Dream Act was in real jeopardy. I'm hopeful that along with the efforts of Laura and Luis and others, that we can rebuild this bipartisan consensus, because we really need it for the good of the country. And I fear that we've gone in the wrong direction since 2016. We'll be able to course correct in November of this year and really make some progress on legislation. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Chairman and Chia. We appreciate your remarks. Going to turn it over to our guest to the DFW area, Mr. Cortez Romero, and talk to us a little bit. Tell us a bit about your story and how you came to this work and came to this case before the Supreme Court.
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for having me and for hosting this great event. My name is Luis Cortez Romero, and I was born in Mexico, but came to the United States when I was 1 year old and grew up in California. So I consider myself even still a Californian, and grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so I am a Giants fan and a 49er fan, for better or for worse. And, considered myself American, almost in every way, except on paper. And my life, even as an adult, but particularly growing up, was just a series of events that taught me what it meant to be undocumented, and really, kind of really posed the question of, how do you define American? And it went from, in California at the time, individuals who didn't have lawful status could not get driver's licenses. So when I was 15 years old, and the rest of my school friends all passed driver's ed, so did I. I couldn't get a driver's license, and it was one of the circumstances where I realized, like, oh, I am limited because I wasn't born here. My father was deported when I was about 14. And, he had no criminal history, had paid his taxes, blue collar worker, had worked 2 jobs. And I didn't really know or realize, why a system like that wouldn't welcome someone who was so hardworking and contributing so much to our community. So there were a series of things like that throughout my lifetime that that really shaped how I viewed, our community, and really made me question about what some of our priorities were. And eventually I graduated from San Jose State University, went to law school at the University of Idaho. And by the way, I went to the University of Idaho because ultimately it was cheaper to pay in-state tuition in Idaho than, or out-of-state tuition in Idaho than in-state tuition in California. And at the time, we're talking about 2010, this is before DACA. This is before really there was a strong support for undocumented students in the way that we see it now. So there was a lot of states that still were grappling with how to do that. At the time, California was barely passing its California Dream Act that would allow some sort of financial help for students, for immigrant students. And so I ended up going to the University of Idaho. From there, I get a job here in Seattle working in immigration law. And my first start, and I think it's worth mentioning that I started law school knowing that I probably wasn't going to get to practice law because I didn't have a work permit. And so I just figured that I would go to law school and, graduate and then figure it out later. There was one point where I really wanted to quit because I didn't think I was going to get to practice law. And I called my mom and let her know that I was going to quit. And she gave me the sternest talking to I think a mom has ever given her son. And she said, you're not quitting. It's really hard for people like us to make it in these spaces. And, we don't know if you're going to get to practice law later or not. But what we do know is they can't unteach you what they've taught you. So go in there and learn everything that you can, and then we'll figure the rest of it later. It was my last year in law school where DACA came out. And so, and DACA is what allowed me to practice law and gave me the basic building blocks that we need to participate in our society. Ultimately, I came to Seattle, and in February of 2017, this is right after President Trump had been inaugurated. And so, he had said a lot about immigration policies, but we weren't sure which one he was going to take away or keep around from the Obama era. And but I ran into a young man, his name is Daniel Ramirez, who was the first DACA recipient to ever be detained under the Trump administration. And at first I thought that the end of DACA was like death by 1,000 paper cuts. They were not going to end the program outright. They were just going to take it away from everybody. And so in working in Daniel's case, it was the first time that we really started thinking about the legal mechanics of DACA. What is it? Can it be challenged in the courts? What kind of protections does it really provide? And we assembled a team of a different cross-section of folks, from corporate lawyers to professors to constitutional scholars. And we all got together to try to really figure out, what is DACA and how we can defend it with Daniel's case. Months later, unbeknownst to us at the time, months later, the program is terminated completely. And so because we already had a blueprint and how to work in Daniel's case, and we already had a strong team assembled together about how to protect DACA, at least at an individual level, we then decided to continue the coalition and protect DACA at a much national level. We knew that states were filing lawsuits to protect DACA, but no one was telling the stories of the DACA recipients, us, who are impacted by the decision to terminate this program. And so we got a cross-section of DACA recipients, doctors, lawyers, community organizers, teachers, special education educators, and we got them together and we filed a lawsuit on their behalf to protect DACA. This is in 2017. And so I've been working on this ground level, arguing in district court, working on the briefs in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals until eventually it went to the US Supreme Court. And ultimately me and this lawyer by the name of Ted Olson, who used to be the Solicitor General under George W. Bush, got together, and we are the ones who worked on the the arguments to present them to the Supreme Court. And I think that's very telling because Mr. Olson is one of a very conservative tenor, again, working under the Bush administration, and even before then, participating in a lot more Republican conservative cases. And it goes to show that when he joins the chorus of voices to advocate for DACA, that is really a no-brainer. That this is a bipartisan, that has bipartisan support and across political aisles, and we just need Congress to really catch up with what the people want. So that's a little bit about me and how I got involved in the DACA case.
I appreciate hearing that so much. I can only imagine how proud your mother is of you today. So congratulations on all of your success. Andres, just take a minute, if you will. You are now a father yourself of two small children. Embedded in the name DACA is protecting children. And philanthropic interests, of course, our own interests at Social Venture Partners is to make certain that all children thrive and do well, because that sets up the world to be in a much better place. Do you think any differently about this issue, or anything that you want to respond to from the panel, particularly now that you have children of your own?
Well, I mean, I look at my son and my daughter, and I am thankful for everything I received, because they are the indirect recipients of that as well. And they're Americans. They are Americans. They will be Americans. They are Americans through and through. And I don't think that's something my father ever imagined. I don't know that I imagined it really, but here we are. And it's thanks to the efforts of activists like Luis and political leaders like Representative Anchia and so many others. One thing Luis mentioned and Representative Anchia mentioned as well, my understanding is there's always been a good amount of support particularly for youth, for undocumented youth, for immigrant youth. I feel like a lot of the surveys and polls say that most Americans support relief for undocumented youth. In Texas, we've seen it, right, at different times. So what is it that seems to continue blocking more progress? Even, what is it? I think Luis put it, we're waiting for Congress to catch up. I've even read that immigration issues, although they seem like they draw a lot of attention, they don't necessarily drive elections. So what is it, do you guys think, Luis or Representative Anchia, what is it that stops what seems to be an issue where there's a lot of support, and yet the political leaders are not able to really push something through? Does it just get tied up in other issues?
That is a really important question, and we're going to hear a little bit about that from the representative in just a moment. But Laura, I want to piggyback on something that Andres said when he said my children are Americans, and in a recent interview, you said basically the same thing about DACA recipients. We know that for all intents and purposes, they're Americans, and the contribution that they make to the world and to the economy is really significant. What did you mean by that when you said we fundamentally know that they're Americans?
Yeah, well, on the economics question, it's very clear. When you give someone an opportunity to work legally, we know they're going to have the opportunity to thrive. And so we've seen that, DACA recipients tend to be on the whole younger, and so their impact is only going to grow. They're at the beginning of their careers, but you give them the opportunity to have things like Luis mentioned, he couldn't get a driver's license. How do you get to work easily if you can't drive a car, especially if you live in a place like Dallas? If you don't have the ability to work in a job that meets your skills and your abilities and your education level, you're not going to thrive in the same way that you would. And Luis is an example of that. You know, he's able to work as an attorney and he has this great education. And without DACA, he probably wouldn't have the ability to have the impact he has. But in terms of the social part of this and what citizenship would do for a DACA recipient, you know, DACA doesn't give the full benefits of citizenship. It just allows people the opportunity to breathe a little easier temporarily and do what they can to thrive economically. But we know that citizenship really matters. We know naturalization of immigrants really matters. We know that they tend to earn more over time, and we know that they're better members of the community. If you can't vote, what is your real incentive to be as involved in your community as possible? And so there are just some benefits of citizenship that really, really matter. And unless we're willing to extend those to DACA recipients, there will be a process, obviously, but that needs to happen. And I actually want to touch a little bit on what Andre said too, because and when I look at this from a policy perspective in terms of immigration, one of the things that we know is that there's been some form of the DREAM Act in front of Congress for nearly 20 years. It's bipartisan, always had bipartisan sponsors, hasn't been able to get across the line. You know, you kind of wonder, there were presidents in office that probably would have signed it had it gotten across the line earlier, but it gets muddied with other issues. And one of them is an immigration issue itself, in that, you know, we tend to see there be a compromise on border security. We tend to see there be a compromise on what to do with the undocumented, including DACA recipients. Congress doesn't like to take votes on future flows. They don't want to pick the winners and losers in our immigration system. They don't want to say that we're going to allow in these types of immigrants in these numbers from these countries, because they are picking winners and losers. And that's a really difficult hurdle to get over. And until Congress is willing to take that tough vote, I don't see a lot of progress being made on something that should be easy, like a DREAM Act.
Thank you for that, Representative Anchia. Give us more hope, please. We want to know, you know, there is bipartisan support. The vast majority of Americans support this. Tell us how you see it. What's the future hold?
Yeah, Laura's absolutely right. In Congress, DACA gets lumped in with a bunch of other issues and those other issues are also solvable, by the way. They're actually not that difficult. And I know if you talk to a member of Congress, they'll say, oh, it's so complicated. The reality is that we have to increase the size of legal immigration if we're going to solve anything. And that bipartisan consensus about opening the spigot to increase legal immigration is completely eroded since 2016, and even before that. I mean, our governor was the only governor in the country who turned away refugees that every other state, blue and red states, took. We can't even sort of cross the Rubicon on some of the most sympathetic people in our society. A refugee who's experienced terrible hardship, terrorism, violence from war. And so if you sort of rank where people are, you know, you've got refugees should be among the most sympathetic people of faith, have always answered the call on refugees from biblical times. And then the next group probably is our DACA recipients, right? The youngest, the most vulnerable from our community who are making incredible contributions. Then is sort of our immigrant community writ large that is helping us recover from hurricanes. They're the essential workers in our economy. They're helping build the United States. They're the oxygen in the veins. They're another sympathetic cohort. But regrettably, the language of immigration has devolved, in my opinion, from a discussion of contributions to illegality, criminality, bad hombres, you know, criminals and rapists, and this is where leadership matters, right? Either at the state level or at the federal level, leadership matters to set the right tone, create the correct narrative, to give people space in order to take the tough votes that Laura was talking about. candidly, in this environment, I don't have a lot of hope that there will be a that space that candidly Republican members need to take any vote on immigration, where they feel like they can suffer electoral consequences. And Marty Linsky has said for years, and he has this book that he gives to politicians called Leadership on the Line. He said, leadership is disappointing your constituents at a rate that they can absorb. And right now, we don't have the requisite space for even a DACA vote, much less a broader comprehensive immigration reform vote. And the tension there is that even if you separated DACA out from the rest of the comprehensive immigration reform discussion, well, if you did, and by the way, United We Dream and other DACA advocacy groups say don't do that because they're advocating for everybody in the immigrant community. But if you did, then suddenly you peel off one of the most sympathetic and politically active groups in the entire immigration discussion, and you leave what some of my friends would consider less sympathetic immigrant cohorts, and that makes the entirety of the discussion more difficult. And I think that's the tension that you're seeing: lack of political courage, and also the desire to get something comprehensive done, with the face of that discussion being our DACA recipients, who are politically mobile, astute, highly educated, and then also very sympathetic because they were brought here as children. And that's what's preventing us from getting it over the goal line. The last point I will make on this is that we need immigrants. I mean, whether you're looking at the numbers from the Bush Institute or the Federal Reserve or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that estimates that we need about 500,000 immigrants year over year to power the U.S. economy, even in lean times like today, where immigrants are overwhelmingly securing our food supply and allowing us in working in this difficult COVID context to actually feed us as a community. Even with all that, I see the prospects as very, very difficult. If you have, and I will say that this was the greatest failure of the Obama administration. I was an Obama appointee, but I can say this actively. He tried that grand bargain where he said, even when Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the presidency, he said, okay, we're going to lead with Obamacare, and then we'll get to comprehensive immigration reform. There wasn't enough bandwidth to do both, candidly. And he tried to appease Republicans by increasing deportation substantially, saying, okay, I'm going to be tough on deportations, but you have to give me immigration reform. That bargain was a fool's errand in the end, and it did not work. So I think the only way we get comprehensive immigration reform is with the Democratic House, Senate, and President, and just ramming something through after November, or potentially in the lame duck.
Thank you. Mr. Cortez Romero, you talked in our briefing call a bit about how we got here, and we know that organizing and strategy are really key roles to getting any kind of legislation through. And you talked about the role that young people played. Can you share a little bit about that? And if you have a call to young people today in response to where we are currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to consider is that the concept of allowing any section of the population, of the undocumented population, to stay, if we're talking about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was a very controversial topic. And now the discourse has moved to at least recognizing the contributions of dreamers. And I think one of the important things to consider when we're talking about the history of dreamers, because I think a question that's oftentimes posed is, why does the immigrants' rights movement now look different than it did in times past? And I think really it goes back to Texas. Texas in 1972 and 1975, there was a big discussion about whether undocumented students should have a K through 12 education. And there was a lot of contention about that. Ultimately, that question that originated in Texas in a case called Plyler versus Doe went all the way up to the US Supreme Court and said, the US Supreme Court said, you have to provide K through 12 education to everybody, regardless of immigration status. And it was that ruling that came from a Texas discussion and a Texas case that ultimately provided K through 12 education to everybody in the United States. that ended up happening in the 80s, and the beneficiaries of that decision are the age and of the generation of the dreamers now. And so, you know, as we start seeing the kind of where that kind of the dreamer, you know, kind of cohort came from, it really kind of started building from there a little bit, and started from Texas. But dreamers, you know, one of the things to consider is that the DACA was always supposed to be a strategy, never a endpoint. And so in 2008, when Obama ran for the first term, he championed, you know, immigrants' rights protections with great fanfare. But by 2012, when he was going to be reelected, he was on pace to deport more than any other president ever in the history of the United States. And so the immigrants' rights movement turned from, you know, a pathway to citizenship to all to we need to stop some of the most damaging actions against our communities, which is deportation. And so activists, not lawyers, activists were the ones who came up with Deferred Action for childhood arrivals, the structure of it that largely mirrors the DREAM Act that has been stalled in Congress. And they did the legal research. They're the ones who presented it to the Obama administration. And it was through direct nonviolent action that really rose that conversation. It was sit-ins in his campaign and his campaign office, interrupting him when he was doing campaign speeches and holding him to the promises he made to immigrants in 2008. And I think it's without surprise that in 2012, an election year, is when he announced the DACA program as a political concession, not as a gift to immigrants, as he sometimes likes to put his gloss on it. And so it's the activism of young people that I think really was the one that provided the political pressure to have, you know, something happen on a nationwide basis. And I think that's very considerable, because if we're talking about the undocumented population, you know, we're at a bit in a disadvantage because we can't vote. And so oftentimes you know, it's easy for some of the legislators to leave our voice to the side if we're not, you know, if they're counting votes. And so it's this activism by young people that happened in 2012 that really led to that. And I truly believe that that's also what's going to give us our voice in Congress as well, to make sure that we're putting that political pressure. I will also say that DACA has been an unqualified success. And I think it really goes to show what the outcome might be if we provide this type of benefit and protection to our original dreamers, which was our parents who came to the United States with a dream about our future. And I think it's important to be concrete here, because if we're talking a lot about the economy and the contribution of dreamers, 72% of the top 25 Fortune 500 companies employ dreamers, from IBM to Apple to General Motors to Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Home Depot. And about 50,000 DACA recipients started businesses since receiving DACA, and each one employs an average of about 4 to 5 other workers. That's 86,000 additional jobs into the economy. I mean, these are important numbers here when we're talking about the economy, particularly in light of a pandemic. And you know, in a time where economic stability is a little unclear. And so, you know, but it really stemmed from the ongoing pressure. And I think the economic contributions also applies political pressure, because, you know, Tim Cook and Apple provided their own briefs to the Supreme Court, so expressing their, you know, how much they need DACA. So did the American Medical Association. So did Fortune 500 companies. And so the activism that we're seeing isn't just on the line activism, is the activism that we bring from the private sector, the business sector, that are coming in and essentially putting their money where their mouth is, right? In the saying, we are standing by our DACA recipients because of the economic contributions, and it's also the right thing to do. And so I think this activism really comes from different levels, from the business venture, from the on-the-ground tactics, and I'm really hoping that that is a sustained pressure that we can continue moving forward throughout this really important election year.
Thank you, Luis. Andres, you're much closer to young activists than I am. What do you see out there? Are the young folks still enthusiastic and organizing around these issues? Are you participating in any of that? Any response you want to give to that from a young person's perspective?
I'm getting farther and farther away by the second, to be honest with you. But no, what I do see, what I have seen in the people that I've met, is that the energy is still very much there. And I think you can even hear it in Luis's voice and others that have worked alongside him and with him that I've had the privilege of meeting over the last few years. And you know, I don't know any important social movement that hasn't had that kind of youth energy and involvement. So I think the energy and the efforts are still there. I think there are people that are still working very hard, and they don't always get credit. You know, it's always behind the scenes. I think leadership can often be behind the scenes, and it's the tough slog of convincing people to do the right thing. But I know that there's a lot of people in Dallas and beyond that are still working very hard to do this. And you know, sometimes for hope in the future and sometimes for fear, right? Because of the uncertainty about what's going to happen to them when they're not immigrants, but also there's people that are not immigrants and that sympathize and empathize and are involved as well.
Thank you. Laura, I want to throw this question to you. The sense about business organizing and the case for the economics and helping businesses succeed. Dallas is a capital of business. Do you see much organizing going on in the business community around these economic issues and DACA?
You know, I think the business community has been really at the forefront of immigration advocacy for a really long time. If you go back all the way to the 1920s, we had basically open immigration at that point, with a few exceptions. And when there was this big quota bill that really severely restricted immigration in 1924, and what you saw in the fight before that bill was passed, and in the fight subsequent to that in the 40 years after, until we got to the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, is that you saw a lot of interest, particularly talking about economics and skills and workers and who do we need here. And so the arguments have not changed. You can look back at those arguments and they're exact same ones we're having today. Economists and people interested in workers and having people here to fill skills gaps, which we absolutely have, even in the middle of the pandemic-induced recession that we are seeing. There's still a skills gap. There are still industries that need skilled workers. Those arguments have been around for over a century. We've been talking about them this entire time. And on the other side, the side that wants to restrict immigration, their arguments remain the same. These people aren't going to assimilate. They're not going to speak English. They're not going to have any success. They're not going to move up the ladder and live the American dream. And we really see that's just not true. We see people do become fully American, if not themselves, then their children certainly do. We see that they do move up the socioeconomic ladder. They become contributing members of society. And so these arguments just haven't changed. And so you do see, and it actually becomes a point of contention really amongst the set of people who don't want additional immigration, that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is always behind and supportive of comprehensive immigration reform, because they know what it means to the success of their members, and they know what it means to the success of the economy. And so you do actually see a lot of people who don't want more immigration, who really would probably side with the Chamber of Commerce on a lot of other issues, that really dislike their support for immigration reform. I want to make one more comment, though. You know, the representative mentioned that, you know, the tone of this conversation and leadership and the role that those two things play. And tone matters so much when you're talking about this, and responsible language matters so much when you're talking about something as sensitive as immigration, because you're really talking about people, and people have inherent value beyond economics. You know, we really like to see their economic benefits, but all of us have inherent value. And, you know, it's not enough for us to just rely on our political leadership to set the tone for this conversation. Each and every one of the people listening to this webinar has the ability to be a leader in their own community, in their own household, whichever of, you know, if it's your school or your church or your place of business, you can be the leader that sets the tone of this conversation. And you can be the person that has responsible language and facts and talks about solutions. You know, I think the American people really want to see solutions on this topic instead of more divisiveness. And so that is my call to all of you today. This is your call to action. Please be a leader in your community on this issue.
I appreciate that. Representative Anchia, do you want to respond to that in any way? For most of what we've been dealing with in the last several months in our country is the issue around racism, systemic racism. morality of that, the immorality of that, being anti-racist. Is there any framework in which this issue is couched in that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, oftentimes people exclusively talk about DACA through the frame, through a Latino frame. And yes, you know, a vast majority of DACA recipients are Latino, over 600,000 of the 700,000 in the United States. But you have about 120,000 Asian Americans that are DACA recipients, 11,000 Black DACA recipients. And so there is an intersectionality to this discussion that's really important. I also think that there is, you know, alongside the discussion of racism and cruelty that we see on a daily basis in this country, there is a symbology or symbolism that is really the frame for this discussion. When Latinos consume the narrative, as Laura was saying on DACA, they look at it through this way, and whether you're watching Univision or Telemundo or other Spanish language media, if you treat the most vulnerable in our community this way, if you treat the children in a cruel and unjust way, children that are contributing massively to our society, that are following the rules, if you treat them in this way, how are you going to treat us? And that symbolism is really important when it comes to DACA recipients. And it speaks to a broader tenor of our politics today, and that we have lost that compassion, that compassionate conservatism that Texas's own George W. Bush ran on years ago. That compassion is really missing from the public sphere. And DACA recipients have done way more than just proving their worth to this country and their loyalty to this country. I mean, we have people in the military, for example, that don't have Latinos in the military, African Americans or Black people in the military that are DACA recipients. That are proving their loyalty on a regular basis. You know, when the first time we got the SB4 bill, that Papers, Please bill in the legislature, and all of you know that it passed just a couple of years ago, and really was an ugly time in Texas. And because it is in place and the Attorney General weaponizes it, it continues to be very scary for Latinos. But the first time it happened, I talked about Thomas Jefferson High School in Dallas, and the author of the bill at that time had gone to Thomas Jefferson, and I pulled out his yearbook and I opened it to the page of the ROTC, right? And it was during Vietnam that he was at TJ, and there were only about, I don't know, maybe a dozen kids in ROTC during the height of Vietnam. Because obviously, if you were in ROTC at that time, you were probably going to go and fight in Vietnam. And that's when Thomas Jefferson was about, 90% Anglo. They used to be called the rebels and would fly the rebel flag. Fast forward, and I asked the commandant, how many kids at Thomas Jefferson High School were in ROTC? And he said 400. And this was during our conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I asked him how many of them he thought were undocumented. He said over half. And I asked him, why do you think that is? Why do undocumented young people sign up for ROTC and potentially subject themselves to a military conflict? And he said, they love this country and they just want to serve. And that's really the exclamation point on DACA. These are young people. They consider this their country and they want to serve. And I think we need to return to a more compassionate and inclusive narrative in our political discussion today, most notably on DACA.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Cortez Romero, you have the last few words with us here. And as I mentioned a couple of times, you're speaking to mostly a regional audience. We have some elected officials tuning in, and definitely engaged civic leaders with us today. What words of advice do you have for us here locally? What can we do?
Yeah, I think immigrants' rights really does start at a local level. While Congress is the one who can ultimately provide a pathway to citizenship, there's a lot that can be done at a local level to protect immigrants' rights and help us be part of your community. Where, with some examples is allowing everyone to get driver's licenses, and I think that makes all of the communities better. And that's something that can be done at a local level. Making sure that law enforcement is providing and responding to the needs of the community, and making sure that they're serving the community and not just doing the dirty work for the Department of Homeland Security and their immigration and deportation enforcement to separate families, which sometimes ends up happening where law enforcement aren't necessarily responding to crimes. They're moving people back and forth to be deported. And so making sure that our local community are responding to the needs of the community and have immigrant friendly policies is definitely one that is proactive, and is one that can be done at the local level. And and I think it's also important because even if at a city level, if we're passing ordinances and things like that that are immigrant friendly, if you can change a city, you could change a county, which can ultimately change the discourse of a state. And I think that's something that is really important as we're talking about the tone and the tenor of the conversations, where we're talking about people who were just looking to contribute to America. And I think nothing's more important than really the private sector from a multitude of factors, from either letting, voicing the contributions of immigrants that they have in your company, to contributing to immigrants' rights work, to allow this to keep moving, to contributing directly to philanthropic or community-based organizations that help immigrants directly. Like one of the nonprofits that do a lot of work, there's a lot of nonprofits that do a lot of work at the border that help refugees and asylum seekers just get basic necessities like food and water. And so the private sector becomes really, really important. And it actually became really important in DACA. We worked significantly with the private sector, reaching out to the Fortune 500 companies to get them engaged in the conversation. And, once we got them a part of the conversation, we know a lot of other people were going to be listening. So, getting involved could be in a lot of different ways. And it starts at the ground level for sure, to be proactive and helping our community.
In our last few minutes, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to reflect a little bit on the last 4 months or so, and how you've been changed by that. The pandemic, the structural racial issues that have been highlighted, the DACA decision. How has that changed you? How are you changed in how you're going to live your life going forward when we get on the other side of all of this? Ms. Collins, if you wouldn't mind responding to that first.
Well, in some sense, not a lot has changed for me. I was thinking about undocumented workers in the food chain long before anybody else, I think, in the general public really was. So, that puts a spotlight on them. But I think in terms of the other things that have happened, a lot of us, I think, have spent time thinking about, not just, oh, we've come so far, but how far we have to go, particularly on race relations in the United States. And so that's really what I'm thinking about going forward is, what is left to accomplish, and what do each of us have to contribute to that?
Representative Anchia?
It's caused me to take stock in the privilege that I enjoy. I, unlike many DACA recipients or members of the immigrant community, because of my parents' hard work and sacrifice, I am able to isolate myself during a pandemic. I don't have to subject myself to the community spread. I have a choice to work from home. The firm that we founded permits me that luxury. Most people in community, most people who are our essential workers don't have that luxury, whether they're first responders or potentially teachers, nurses. Many of the DACA recipients that occupy those positions don't have that luxury and have to be subjected to the community spread. It also lays bare, candidly, some structural inequities that have become even more pronounced during COVID, whether it's issues like paid sick leave, Medicare expansion, Medicaid expansion in the state of Texas. The lack of making those sort of, or the failure to make those policy decisions have just exacerbated not only the pandemic itself, but have also caused unnecessary suffering among our essential workers. And the last thing I would note, and Alfredo Corchado pointed this out. He's a reporter for the Dallas Morning News, former Mexico City bureau chief. He had a beautifully written piece that said, if we are essential, how can we be illegal? And it's caused me to ponder that issue. If we are essential as frontline workers, if we are essential to the food chain in this country, if we're essential to replacement population in the United States, if we are that oxygen that flows through the veins of this country, as immigrants have been for centuries, how is it that we can be illegal? And again, back to the point I made and sort of amplifying the work that Laura does, we need to expand legal immigration so we can reduce illegal immigration and then confront the people who really do want to do us harm, because they're out there, but we need to direct resources to those people and not try to interdict the people who want to contribute and help this country be greater. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Cortez Romero, how have you been changed through this last 4 months?
Well, I mean, from a very practical, kind of selfish level, the DACA decision made it so that I can't be deported. So that's great. And that was a huge sigh of relief. You know, it's a bit of a sort of Damocles that was handing over us, me and 800,000 other people. So we were breathe easy a little bit, and it gave us, you know, I think a little bit of light of hope that we were all looking, you know, during this time. But one of the things that I think really stands out to me amongst this, you know, kind of, we need to have, it seemed to have this kind of wave of bad news after another, is really, you know, how I see the measure of a community, not by the bad things that occur in it, by how the people respond to the bad things that occur to it. And what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of people that care, that are coming together and responding to some of these very important core issues in great numbers. And the allies, I think, is so important. There's so many allies that are coming to help the impacted community that are giving us strength in numbers, from the immigrants' rights community to, you know, the Black Lives Matter community to really all the different types of disenfranchised community. And I feel so hopeful about the allies and the people coming together and responding together to make, you know, to help us reach our highest ideals of what we know we can be, and to make us more perfect. Because I think that there is, you know, I don't see anything more American than seeing the idea of America as a work in progress, and having the self-confidence to be self-critical about what we can do better, because we love this country. And so seeing people come out in great numbers, from allies to the impacted community, gives me so much hope for the future. And I think that's something that I've really, you know, seen and highlighted through the last 4 months.
Thank you, sir. And you give us hope for the future. And we are so grateful for the work that you are doing. Thank you. Andres, how about you? Thank you so much once again for stepping up and helping and your firm for sponsoring this. How have you been changed over the last few months?
Well, thank you, Tony, and thanks to my partners and the law firm for being here and supporting this. I also feel very privileged. I feel very thankful for the efforts of my dad, my mom, heading off into the unknown almost 30 years ago, so that we could be here and build a life here. I feel very thankful for my job, for my family. But to build off what we said, it's emphasized just how important it is, I think, to have hope, to believe in the future, and looking into what Latino or Hispanic jurors think in a jury trial, general viewpoints. I ran into something pretty interesting, that Latinos and Hispanics believe even more so in the American dream than Americans. They believe that hard work can get you ahead. They believe that their children will be better than they are today. And I think that kind of hope, that kind of optimism is what we need as we head off into uncertain waters, into difficulties and challenges. I think we need that hope. And I think this time has really emphasized how important it is.
Thank you. I want to thank each of our panelists for taking the time to be with us today. You're extraordinary human beings, and the contribution that you're making to civil society is really amazing. And I'm grateful that you would take time to be with Social Venture Partners to do this. I'm also grateful to our series sponsors, Ray Knatzer and Something Good Consulting, Forward DFW, and again, Andres, to you and your firm, Lynn Pinker, Hurst, and Schwagman, for being with us today and being the sponsor and presenting sponsor. Andres, if you will permit me, I would like to end our session with just one line of a recent article that you wrote that your sister sent me to make sure that I knew about your great work that you're doing. And you said that the justices harkens us back to those times in which our courts and politics have helped instead of oppressed the others in our society. If there is anything that Social Venture Partners is about and philanthropy is about as a whole, it is to make sure that the others in society are brought in to be full members and contributing members and fully supported of our society. So if you would like to join the work of Social Venture Partners, please reach out. We would be happy to have each of you in our efforts. Again, thank you to our audience. Thank you to the partners and our board of directors at Social Venture Partners, and to our esteemed panel for joining us for this conversation today. Thank you so much.